Way back in the 1980s, when I started playing electric guitar, we had guitars and we'd have a lead, and then it would go into your amplifier. It might go through a couple of stomp boxes on the way. There were only a handful of stomp box manufacturers back then. Now everything's changed. Now we've got software now. You can plug your guitar into iOS, GarageBand, and get a pretty decent sound out of those guitar preamps, so the guitar simulations that are built into it. But the reason I'm going to demonstrate this thing today, this is the Pod Line 6, the original one, is because somebody asked me, somebody said, oh, but what's that amp? Have you ever seen a real Fender Blues? And I thought, oh, crikey, things have really moved on. So this thing here really represents the bridge, I think, between a guitar amp, which I've got underneath here, underneath the pod, and these GarageBand models that you can plug into, because it's tactile. You've got control knobs on here, you can tweak to your heart's content and get a pretty good sound. Furthermore, I've just looked on eBay and you can buy things like this for £20 or £30. You know, that's the price of a round of drinks, and you can get all of this technology in this box. And this, I bought this in 1999, 20th century, and it still works absolutely fine. It doesn't require any operating system updates. It doesn't say, oh, I've reached the end of my life, therefore I'm not going to power up, etc., etc. So what we've got here is a set of amplifier models around here. There are 16 positions on this switch. The Pod Mark II came with 32, so you'd hold the shift button down and then find your secondary sound. But frankly, if you're not happy with any of the 16 sounds on here, then maybe it might be the player, it might just be the guitar's not very nice, it might just be that you haven't found your sound yet, because 16 things is quite a lot. If you wanted 16 guitar amps in the 1980s, you had to have a lot of money and a lot of storage space, and a lot of money to constantly buy valves for them all. So I'm going to start with this setting here. It's called Tube Preamp, and I've got the drive control down, my bass, middle and treble in the middle. Now these controls, by the way, aren't the endless controls that you have on modern stuff like the Line 6 Helix, for example, which is their flagship creation from nowadays. These are just classic 0 to 10 as you'd find on a guitar amp. So it really feels like an amplifier, this. So here's just the tube preamp. Just a straight through DI, if you like. If you crank the drive up, it'll just sound like you've just overloaded that valve circuit. Fine. Now, if I just forget these pod ones for a second, I'm going to go around to Small Tweed, which is the first sort of amp model that's actually designed and based on an actual thing that was in the past. And this is the little Fender sort of Blues Junior. And it was a very small amplifier, only an 8-inch speaker in it, so it sounds quite thin, but quite nice for blues. So it is quite a sort of just a very basic guitar sound. It's what you bought with your Telecaster back in the 50s. So the bass, middle and treble controls on the original amp model, there wouldn't have been all this sort of bass, middle and treble business. It would have been volume on, which was in your on and off switch, and maybe a tone control depending on the model. So you have things like that on your treble. And there's your tone. Pretty wide ranging. The bass in the middle don't really do much. It's just to make use of those controls. So when the controls are in the middle, they are essentially flat, if you like. They don't have any effect on the circuit. So there's your Small Tweed, and if I crank the drive all the way up, you get a really nice sound of that little amp just going, ah, and just basically being at full tilt. Great. Tweed Blues. Now the next one round. it's kind of like this amplifier that I've got sat under here. Now I'm going to use this amp in a minute because you can use the pod with a guitar amp, which is quite clever because you're getting all this sort of modern sort of software and still with a tactile sort of control surface within a guitar amp. So it's great for live work if you want sort of more sounds than your amp can produce. So that is your classic sort of Fender Blues DeVille from the 1950s. You've got an master output level there, and then a channel volume here. Now that's when you sort of do things like programming this up and saving your presets, which you can do. So that's kind of, you know, the modern approach to it. So if I now turn around to black panel, I've got a Fender sort of Fender Twin, like a 100-watt sort of high-power Americana box. So if I just turn the output level up a bit and the drive all the way down, this is what you would do if you wanted your funk sort of Nile Rodgers-y. Nice and jangly, great. And the Fender Twin had a bit more sort of variation with your bass, middle and treble. It was a bit more wide-ranging than other valve amps. Especially so with the top end. So you could get sort of jazzier tones out of it to take the drive up a bit. So you could make it sound silky as well. Very nice. I'll just return those controls back to the middle. There we go. So the next one round, Modern Class A. Now, with all of these names, you think, well, Class A, Brit, Blue, what the hell does that mean? It's essentially a copyright issue. You can't just put Marshall, Vox, Fender around the side of your amp models because you get taken to the cleaners. So Modern Class A, but it does say this in the manual. It says it's a model of a such and such. Modern Class A is a matchless, which is a very expensive handmade valve amp, you know, proper pro kit. Now, as with all of these sounds, lots of people go, oh, it doesn't sound like that. It hasn't got that sort of, you know, yeah. If it sounds good, use it. It doesn't matter if it's not really the sound that may have been in the 1950s. You know, you can't compare something like this in a pair of studio monitors to a 4x10 Fender sat on the floor. You can't do it. My Roland VK7, which is a Hammond emulator, you know, when you sat at a B3 Hammond, it's a different ball game. So but the simulations are very clever and they sound convincing, especially on a recording. So next one round, Brit Class A. This is a Vox AC30 top boost model. So the bass, middle and treble here goes slightly out of the window because the Vox AC30 only had bass and treble on it. And then it had a third control, which is called tone cut. Or just cut, depending on the model and the era and all that. So the bass and the treble are very interactive with each other as well. If you turn the bass up, all the treble goes and vice versa. The middle is the cut, which for the moment I'm just going to put all the way up so you can hear the treble essentially passed all the way through to the power amp. So one control affects the other, as it does on an AC30. So it's pretty good, really. There's a lot of thought gone into this and a lot of very clear processing. So if I turn the drive up, you know, I can get that sort of, you know, Brian May type sound out of this. If I turn this down here. You can get that real silky, smooth, quite sort of milky. There's not much sort of top end there, but you know, it's a great sound. You wind the drive right up. You know, it's, of course, that's not the sort of Brian May sound. I've got the wrong guitar, and I'm also very, very by a long chalk not as good as Mr. May. But it's just interesting because you can get so many noises out of one box. And this was a major boon. When this arrived through the post, I ripped the box open. I played with it. I must have sat with it for 4 or 5 hours just thinking, this is amazing. I've got all these noises. And it really was a boon back then. I don't think lots of the kids maybe don't really understand how important something like this was. Now, I'm just going to move around now to Brit Blues. Now, this is the JTM 45, or the Marshall Blues Breaker. Fantastic guitar amp from the sort of 1960s, and it just had that real gritty top end. So you can, comparing it with the Brit Class A amp, they're just two different animals. Drive, let's take that all the way up. Yeah, that is the sound of a clean amp being wound right up. Now, if we move around to Brit Classic, we've got a sort of Marshall Plexi, which is basically just got more gain in it than that Blues Breaker. Now, of course, there's been hundreds of Marshall amps and sort of editions and all that over the years, but really we've just got 3 around here. We've got the sort of bluesy one, the sort of classic rock one, and then the high gain, which is like a sort of JCM 900 kind of thing, where you've just got even more gain and more control over your EQ. So, the next one round, Rectified. What's that? Well, it's a Mesa Boogie, which is a very high gain, very, very sort of high-end guitar amp. Now, most guitar amps that you would normally play through, if you're playing at that sort of level, you get this sort of thing. You get all that buzzing. You know, the amp's sort of sat there going, oh, I want to... But we have a noise gate button on here. We have a noise gate button in here which essentially just opens the sort of amp when you start playing through it. Great for your recording, especially if you're using an old sort of multi-track sort of hard disk recorder or a tape recorder where you don't want all that noise in the background, maybe. And it doesn't cut that sound out too much at the bottom either, so it's pretty useful bit of kit there. Next one round, modern high gain. This is like a Soldano, it's kind of your Santana sort of sound. So if you're playing smooth. They're all great simulations and they sound good. Fuzzbox. This is kind of your classic sort of Hendrixy thing. If I wind the gain all the way up. The reason Fuzzbox is on its own and not a guitar amp as such is lots of people used to just play through those and record straight to tape. So no guitar amp required. So there are your amp simulations. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to the, let's go back to the Tweed Blues. And I'm going to show you a few of these effects on the right hand side here. So literally you just dial in an effect and it kind of makes a noise. That's the beauty of this. You haven't got lots of menus saying, oh, I want an 8th order phaser with a 0.35 hertz sweep. You know, this is not how guitar pedals and guitar amps used to work. It was just turn the controls until you're happy and then play the thing. So let's have a look at the tremolo first. Now this is the classic 1950s effect that was built into lots of these Fender amps and also the Vox AC30. Now, effect tweak. That's a great name for it because it's just saying turn it until you find something you like. Now, the speed of that tremolo can be controlled with this, the tap tempo. You can see that flashing just there. So you decide on how fast you want it to do by just pressing that at a certain rate. That's great. So, you can also do it by holding the tap tempo and then selecting a speed more fine-tuned with your effect tweak there. So if I just go like this. So it's a bit finer control, but sometimes just tap tempo. Oh yeah, I like that speed. Yeah, it's fine. Now, all of the amplifier models, they are attached to a reverb. Now, in the case of the amps that didn't have reverb, it just sticks a reverb on there that's sort of generic that you can use. So the Tweed Blues, for example, if I go to Black Panel, for example, that will probably be a more clear model to use. I'm just going to switch the effects off. But the reverb is just the classic Fender reverb spring. Dial it in and use it. So, chorus 1, which is the next one round. This is like an early boss chorus. It's going to set the chorus rate slower there. And you dial in the amount with your effect tweak here. You can hear that little sort of rustling sound. That's just the processor going, more chorus, more, and it's all driven off this control. So once you've set it, it'll settle down fine. Chorus 2 is a bit more of a sort of modern chorus. It's a bit more complex. So you can play that. I'd love that. That chord has to be played through a chorus. Flanger. Great. Flanger 2. Bit more of a complex one again. Now I have an idea that chorus 2 is also stereo because we have left and right outputs here. You're listening in mono at the moment because I've got one side going to the recorder that you're listening to this on, and the other lead is just hanging over my Fender amp here. So I'm going to plug that in a minute so you can hear it. Then we've got the rotary control. Now this is quite a nice thing. This is like a Hammond simulator, and this is better in stereo, but I'll give you the mono version. You can hear it just fine. And then characteristically with the Leslie cabinet, it would take time to slow down because it was all motors, pulleys and belts. And your effect tweak doesn't really do anything there. And characteristically with the rotary speaker simulation, you only get 2 speeds. You get slow, which is called chorale, or fast, which is tremolo if you look at the original Hammond. Delay, the classic echo. Effect tweak will basically raise the amount of repeats that you get, the effect level. You can get your effect rate by tapping the tempo again, or you can turn this. You can turn this in conjunction with that. You can't set how many milliseconds or the BPM or whatever on this. You just have to set it as musically according to what you're listening to. So all of these effects around the left-hand side are repeated around the right-hand side, but with the addition of your delay. So you've got this sort of two things. It's not all super user selectable with lots of different adjustments, but you just dial something in and if it works, great, just use it. Now, this also came with a separate, well, bought separately, a foot switch, which was a big long switchboard with the wah-wah pedal on as well. Now, I've got that thing somewhere. I can't find it actually. And it's just connected to the back of this via an Ethernet lead. And it gives you a little bit more fine control over effects and things like your wah-wah. And it's also got a volume pedal on it as well, which is really useful. So that's more your live thing. But really, this is aimed at people who just want to get a good guitar sound and to have something that is the convenience of just a small package like this. You can plug headphones in the other side here on the left-hand side. And we have a switch on the back here, just next to the outputs, which is called the AIR mode, direct or amplifier. Now, I'm going to set it, it's set to direct at the moment, I'm going to set it to amplifier. Now, the two sounds are quite similar. There's your direct and there's your amp. Now, the reason for that is I'm going to put this now through the power amp of my Fender amp. I'm going to turn the volume down a bit because that Fender amp essentially is wound right up to the top. So I'm going to now play just the tube preamp through my Fender amp. Now, this is quite helpful. I could use this as a sort of valve breakup box. I could put the pod into the guitar amp and then wind it right up. It's just a different sound to that Fender amp. So let's turn that mic gain up a bit more. So you can put things like, you can add more drive to your guitar amp. It just means that your original guitar amp, which this is a Fender Blues Deluxe, little 40-watt amp, can be given other things to do. So, you know, there's no harm in mixing a Marshall amp simulation on this through a Fender power amp. Why not? You know, you can do that. It doesn't make any difference at all. Nobody's going to go, oh, you're using the wrong setting. Yeah. You have the advantage of then having your guitar amp on stage, so it feels like a guitar amp, rather than, I used to do some duo gigs with this where it was a tiny little pub and we just had a PA system and I needed guitar sound. So I just used to take this and just stick it through the PA system. And to be honest, it sounded fine. Nobody would go, oh, where's your guitar amp? What guitar amp? Oh, you haven't got, oh, it's that, oh, don't like that. It's all subjective. Everything is subjective with this. And I hope you enjoy the sound out of this, because it's very, very lovely indeed. There's so much, and it still sounds modern and kind of edgy and new 20 years down the line. So there it is. There's the pod, the original pod from line 6. Go on eBay, hunt one down. You'll find one for 20, 30 pounds. You might find a really nice one that might be 40 pounds. You never know. You might have to shell out 4,000 of your English pence to find one. So, you know, have a look and good hunting.